and working through chapter 10 of the Gospel of John in this wonderful passage where Jesus declares himself to be the Good Shepherd, and he uses that analogy of the Good Shepherd. And we're looking at different parts of that. Well, today we've come to a part of that analogy and a part of that scripture where our hearts and our minds should naturally be focused on the cross. I want to give you the takeaway right up front. So, in case you fall asleep, you'll already have it. Here's what I want you to know. This is what I want you to take away from the service today. Just this truth, this idea, that the entirety of God's purpose and plan is realized in Jesus' death and resurrection. Jesus is going to unfold that for us even more this morning, but we want to realize that, and we just want to linger there and realize that the entirety of God's purpose and plan for all of creation is realized in that moment. You know, we talk about critical moments, we talk about turning points, we talk about game changers, you know, and from anything from sporting events to world events, there's often that one moment where things turn, or one moment where things come into focus. On an even grander scale, this is the moment when God's purpose and plan really come into focus. And everything before is leading up to this, and then everything after is pointing back to this moment, his death and his resurrection. So we're going to look at John's Gospel in chapter 10. And as we've been saying, Jesus is using this analogy of being a shepherd. It's a picture that is familiar to his audience. And Marcus did a good job of unfolding this for us last week and the week before. It's a culturally familiar picture. It was part of their economy to know shepherds. They served a useful part of the economy. So they knew about shepherds, and it was a familiar picture when he talked about the shepherd being and the gatekeeper and the door of the sheep and calling his sheep by their name and the sheep knowing him. It was a picture that they were familiar with. They could identify with that. And Jesus, being the master teacher, incorporated that. It was a culturally familiar picture, but it was also a spiritually familiar picture. This is a picture that God had used more than once to describe his relationship with his people. And even as we go back in the Old Testament, we can see that God is using that picture because it was familiar to the people. One of our favorite Psalms, the 23rd Psalm, where David declares, "The Lord is my shepherd." He knew about sheep. He was a shepherd, and so that was a familiar picture for him, and just to make that comparison was meaningful, and it's been meaningful for everybody who's read that since. We see the picture. Another example is Isaiah in chapter 40, verse 11. Write that reference down. You might want to look that up later. Where through the prophet, we just have this understanding that he cares for us like a shepherd. He'll gather the lambs in his arms. He'll carry them in his bosom because that's the kind of shepherd he is. So Jesus is pulling from this familiar picture, culturally familiar, spiritually familiar picture. But now we're going to add one more layer to that. Because he's taking that picture that is so familiar to the audience and he's applying it to himself. When he says, "I am the good shepherd." That's more than just a statement. Sometimes when we read this, we think he's just making another analogy. I'm the good shepherd. I'm the door of the sheep. I'm the true shepherd. But I think maybe even more, I think he's just really solidifying this idea that you know about the 23rd Psalm. You know the Lord is my shepherd. You know Isaiah's writings that the shepherd will gather the lambs in his arms. And it's almost as if Jesus is stepping forward to say, here's what you need to know. I am that good shepherd. This picture that you've been familiar with all along. The spiritual analogy that you've loved and thrilled to and taken to heart. It all points to me. I am that good shepherd. Now, as he unfolds that and as we read this passage, we realize that the good shepherd is going to do something. We're in John's Gospel in chapter 10, verse 11. And he says this, "I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. He who is a hired hand and not the shepherd, who is not the owner of the sheep, sees a wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he is a hired hand and not concerned about the sheep. I am the good shepherd, and I know my own, and my own know me, even as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep which are not of this fold, and I must bring them also, and they will hear my voice, and they will become one flock with one shepherd. For this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life so that I may take it up again. No one has taken it from me, but I lay it down of my own initiative. I have the authority to lay it down, and I have the authority to take it up again. This commandment I receive from my Father. And as he drives that point home that he's the good shepherd, he's going to say, now this is what your shepherd is going to do to care for you. I'm going to lay down my life for the sheep. And we see in this passage that the cross is becoming even more in our vision, in our view. More and more as we work our way through John's gospel, we see the cross just coming into view. At first, just kind of on the periphery, but then more and more focused, more and more in view. As we look at the outline of John's gospel, we realize that this is the point where the opposition is increasing. He came to his own, but his own did not receive him. That opposition continues to build. The anger and the hatred, the dividedness about Jesus continues to be wide. That there are some who love him and embrace him and are convinced that he is who he claims to be, the eternal self-existing God who took on flesh. And there are some who are adamant that he could not possibly be that, and that hatred grows. And the events of the cross are looming, and they become part of our focus. This passage, maybe more than most, brings us to the focus of the cross. There is a very clear indication and anticipation of the cross. And not just the cross, and not just his death, but his resurrection. Did you see both of those in there? Jesus said, I am the good shepherd, and I lay down my life for my sheep. And then later he comes back to that point. I lay down my life for the sheep, and I have authority to do that, and I have authority to take it up again. Now, we read that, and we kind of understand what he's talking about here. It's clear to us. It makes sense to us. Marcus mentioned this last week, too, that we have the perspective of history. And so we can see the whole story. We know what he did. And so these words make sense to us. His initial audience didn't know what he was about to do, and so they're left wondering what that is. It wasn't clear to them, but for us it's clear. It's an indication of the cross. It's a clear anticipation of the cross, of his death and his resurrection. And that death and that resurrection is, again, that critical point of all that God wanted to do and was going to do. We saw it last week when Jesus, using that shepherd analogy, said, I am the door of the sheep, and we understood that to mean that in that shepherding economy, that when the shepherd would put his sheep in the fold for the night, he would actually be the door, and nothing came in, nothing went out except through him, except across him, by him. And we realized what he was saying there, that in God's purpose and plan, it all goes through me. And that's the theme through the Scripture, through the Gospels. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. He's made that very clear many times. Well, if that's true, and since that is true, that nothing comes in, nothing goes out through him, we realize that that is even more focused with this statement. That the entirety of God's purpose and plan not only goes through Jesus, but through his death and his resurrection. It all goes through him. It's all realized in Jesus. And so we want to take some moments this morning just to linger there. We don't want to rush through that. We want to linger there and consider what that means for us. And just, in a sense, we're going to delight in the cross. We're going to glory in the cross. We're going to remember what that means for us. The consideration of Scripture, even the songs that we're going to sing here in a minute, would hopefully bring us back to that. Pastor Marcus, come and read for us again some scripture. And as he does that, let's have our praise team come back to the platform.